Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
Ginny, can you explain this whole PR thing to me? I don't really understand it, and I think I need to know how to do it.
Sure, no problem.
All right, right after this. So, PR.
Yes.
It's what a lot of our listeners do. At least it's one of the services that they offer. And when you hire a new employee, you got to figure out, how do I teach these people how to do PR if they're not someone who comes into it with PR experience? And this is a question that came up in the Spin Sucks community lately. So I thought it would be a good one for us to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the specific question was, curious for all you PR pros who run your own service agents or agency, have you come across any great resources on how to approach training new hires to do PR? And it's an interesting question because it was posted and I was like, I guess we do it by just giving them the work to do and coaching them through it. Like we don't necessarily, send them out for professional development specific to quote unquote PR. Like we may do things on writing. We may do things on, certainly we make everybody here go through the PESO Model certification. We might do some things on media relations. But we would take certain skill sets, but just to say, oh, you're in PR now and you're working in PR, we're going to give you that kind of professional development is really more on the job training types of things.
So, I mean, let's back it up a minute. When you're hiring, do you typically hire people with PR experience, or do you typically hire people who, maybe have a different background and they need this kind of training?
It depends. If we're hiring for what I would call traditional PR media relations, we always hire somebody with experience. If we're hiring for, one of the other media types, so shared, owned, or paid, then we hire content creators, or we hire social media experts, or we hired SEM people who've done SEM. We also do an intern program, and the interns have to be studying PR. They can't just be like, yeah, I'm a business major. They actually have to be studying our craft, so they at least have a good understanding. And then we give them, intern level work, not senior AE level work.
So, and I think this is something that agency owners fundamentally need to understand if they don't already, which is that there are plenty of people out there who don't have expertise already. Mm-hmm. And you can't always hire someone who is experienced in whatever you want to do. And particularly in small agencies where you're just growing, a lot of times I will talk with the owners and they'll say, hey, I need to find someone who knows how to do this or that, but they're not willing to pay for it. And so at some point you have to decide, are you willing to pay for them to have the experience coming in, or do you bring in, some, not necessarily raw talent, but some good talent that you can improve their skill set through training, through on-the-job education, and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it depends for sure. And I think it is definitely, you're right, is a choice you have to make. For me personally, I decided a few years ago that we were spending way too much time and resources on training young professionals to do their jobs. And it was easier for us to grow and be as flexible as we want to be with clients if we had people with experience. So I pay for it. And in some cases that means that my salary has decreased, but it's easier for me to run my agency that way.
Well, and I think you do have to look at it as that kind of a conscious choice. Where do you want to invest? Mm-hmm. Do you want to invest the time and money in training, or do you want to invest in the salary of someone who already has that training and experience? And so, you can't expect that you're going to get away with a lower salaried, less experienced individual and have them do the same kind of work. And I think that's the biggest mistake that small agency owners make, because they're trying to pinch pennies, probably because they didn't price correctly, but that's a whole nother episode that I like to rant about all the time.
Last week, in fact.
Absolutely. And so if you are not going to put yourself in a position where you're willing to pay for it, then you do have to come up with how to train for it. So let's assume that you've made this conscious decision that you want to move ahead with bringing someone on who is a little bit greener. What would be the first steps that you would do? Is it purely on the job, or are there resources other than a PESO certification? Obviously, we think you ought to get a PESO certification. But apart from that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking it through, and it's mostly on the job. It's very much like, all right, we have to do this, this, and this. And, I have one young professional. She's probably 7 years out of college now, and who's has never done crisis work. So, she's a phenomenal writer, and she's really great at that craft. But we've been teaching her how to do the crisis side of things as we're working with two particular clients. And she's been a sponge and learning. We certainly don't have her on the front lines, and we don't have her writing the messaging or anything like that. But we do have her come to meetings, and we ask her opinion on things so that we can start to sort of help her understand, okay, this is why that answer is great, and yes, you should continue to do that, and here's how we would handle this one differently, and here's why. So we're doing a lot of on the job training with her specifically around crisis. But I think that I'm just trying to think through how because everybody who's onboarded spends the first 6 weeks going through PESO Model training, and then after that it really is on the job training.
Well, and I think that on the job is really the best way, because even if they've learned somewhere else, even if they've got experience somewhere else, it's the way that some other agency or some other business or organization does it. And it's not necessarily the same as what Armand Dietrich does. And so it's important for any employee that you have to really understand not just PR generally, but PR specific to the way that you're doing it on behalf of your clients. And so this is where I think it's really beneficial to have process documentation and internal things that will help people to understand how you do it. What are the steps that you follow when you're putting together a press release or a blog post or a media relations program, or even the outreach that you're doing to individual reporters, because everybody's got kind of their nuances that are slightly different from agency to agency.
Yeah. And one of the things I would add to that is that I think we tend to, just as human beings, we say, oh, that person has 10 years of experience or 15 years of experience. They know what they're doing. And so we don't do the typical onboarding that we would with somebody who's just out of college or just a few years out of college. And I think that's a really big mistake, because to your point, there are things that you do differently. There are things that there are ways you service clients differently, and that has to be part of the onboarding and the training, because otherwise you're going to get super frustrated with this person and they're going to get super frustrated too, because they have all this experience but they feel like you don't value that, and then you look at them and say, you have all this experience, why can't you do it? And it's because you didn't put them through the proper onboarding and training that you would somebody with less experience.
Well, I think it's a great point that just because they have a job history does not mean that they have expertise.
Right.
One of the things I think I've mentioned before, I used to train baseball umpires. And one of the things that we used to say was that there are some folks out there who are in their 10th year or first year umpire experience. They keep repeating effectively as a newbie over and over again, because they're not doing the things that they need to do to continue to improve, whether that's because they choose not to or somehow they're incapable of it. Usually it's they've chosen not to. They're not investing in their own education and development and all of those kinds of things. And so you can have that in the regular workforce as well, where someone has managed to have longevity, but that doesn't mean that they've actually become good at their craft. And so, beware of that when you're hiring. Know what you're actually getting and probe to make sure that they actually have the expertise you think they do.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see my agency owner clients and my clients, our agency clients, that when they hire people and they go, oh, this person has so much experience, great, go do your thing. And then everybody ends up frustrated 6 months later because there hasn't been any onboarding or training. And that, I would say, that's one of the biggest mistakes I see over and over and over again. So that has to be something that you can't just say, oh my gosh, great, Chip, this is awesome, I'm so glad you joined my team, you have all this experience, go do your job. And you're like, where do I find documents? And how do I sign on to my email? Like, you probably figure it out, but also you'd have to have the same kind of onboarding.
Yeah. And you also need to, this is yet another plug for weekly one-on-ones. If you or whoever the direct manager is of this individual is having that weekly one-on-one, it's your opportunity to answer questions, to serve as a mentor.
Yes.
But it's also your duty in those conversations to figure out, where are they struggling? What help do they need? Is there some kind of specific outside training that they need, or internal documentation that would help them do their job better, or shadowing someone for a little bit of time? What are the things that they need? And if you're doing those weekly one-on-ones, it really helps you to identify those things much more easily and much more quickly.
That's a really great point, because then somebody will say, I need to do X, Y, and Z, but I have no idea where to even start. And you go, oops, sorry.
Right. And you likely have a lot of resources I mean, either your own brain power or other people
Yes.
on your team. There's
Yes.
likely already a lot there. So you don't need to constantly go out and seek and pay for things. You may actually have a lot of the resources available to you
Absolutely.
already that you can leverage. And showing people examples is really powerful. But ultimately, there's really not much of a replacement for actually giving them the opportunity to do the work and potentially fail.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
that, it's another one of the reasons why I often recommend that you treat yourself as a client, because that's a great learning
It is.
ground for
Yep.
your younger employees.
Yep.
Have them do PR on behalf of the agency itself, because the odds that they do something that is catastrophic are really small. And so if they simply are underperforming or make a little faux pas or something like that, that's much more manageable if they're doing it for the agent. And it's psychologically easier for you, the owner, to take that risk versus, you put them on the biggest account and let them screw that up.
Yeah.
So
Right.
look for those opportunities, because it's the actual doing that is where you figure out what they do and don't know, and it also helps them build their confidence that they are learning and executing better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great advice. And you're right. Like we've talked about this before too. One of the things I do, and it still even to this day gets me all like, it's going to be okay. But I'll put as people are growing through their careers, whether or not they're new in our agency, we will start to put them in front of clients. And it's one of the hardest things to do, because you have to be willing to let them quote unquote fail. I mean, they're not going to lose the client for you, but let them lead meetings and you sit in the background and not say a word. And it's so hard to do, because you're watching it and you're going, I wouldn't have said that, or oh, I wouldn't have answered it that way, or oh, and you go through this whole internal debate. But what you can do then is take that opportunity to leave the meeting and have a coaching session with them to say, okay, when you answered this, it was great, and here's why we liked it. But when you answered this, we would have preferred it. We do it this way because this is how we do things. And it gives you that opportunity to coach them and mentor them versus you just stepping in, and it allows the client to see them as the expert versus you stepping in and going, okay, hang on a sec. This is not how we would do things. Like, you have to be really good at just sitting in the background and observing, taking notes, and using that opportunity to coach as you're leading your team through their career development.
And that is really hard for most owners.
So hard. It's so hard.
And look, I've been there. I know it will shock listeners to know I have a very difficult time keeping my mouth shut. I just do. But
so hard.
it's something you really need to work at, because if you are always stepping in and stepping on your subordinates when you are working with clients, the client is never going to trust that individual. The
That's
individual
right.
is never going to have the opportunity to grow.
That's
and you're
right.
going to be stuck. You're going to be in these meetings forever.
Yep.
You need to accept that they can do a good enough job, maybe not exactly the same job you would, but a good enough job and they're not going to put the whole business at risk, that you just need to let them go and let them, coach them through things, mentor them through things. Frankly, you learn a lot from the mistakes that you make along the way. I mean, I always talk about you learn more from failure than from success.
That's
You
right.
have to let your team have the opportunity to mess up a bit in order to continue to advance their own careers and what they can do for you as an agency.
Yeah, we have one client who every single week she sends an email before the weekly team meeting and says, here's the agenda. Is Jenny going to attend? Every week. And every week I send the account leader to the meeting and say, no, Jenny does not attend these meetings. She attends your quarterly meetings and your leadership meetings, but she does not attend every week. She does it every week. And every week our account manager is like, no, here I am. And I feel bad for the person on my team, because she's like, does she not trust me? I'm like, no, it's just her personality. It has nothing to do with you. But I'm also not going to attend those meetings. So
right. Well, and I mean, a lot of clients just like it when the owner is there. I mean,
it's not. I mean, sure, if she wants to pay for it, but her budget doesn't afford it. So no, I will not be there.
And even if it did, it wouldn't really make sense in all likelihood for just about every client account that an agency has for the owner to be actually in it, even if the client's willing to pay for it. So, but I think the other thing when it comes to training people is, to some extent, you got to kind of throw them in the deep end of the pool.
Yep.
and hope that they float.
Yep. Or
Be
doggy
ready to
paddle, at
dive in
least.
after them if they are actually
Yeah,
drowning.
yeah.
Don't just sit there and say,
Oh,
"No,
sorry. Well,
yes, it
next.
was a witch."
Yes, it was a witch. That's funny.
But yeah, but I mean, I think back to my very first internship that I had 30 plus years ago, and I walked in on day one, and the very first thing I was told to do was to write a 1 minute speech for the member of Congress that I was interning for.
Oh,
And just, here's some basic background research on the topic. And by the way, it was a complex tax topic that I had no idea. I didn't understand at all. I barely understand it even today, even though but it was a really arcane bit of the tax code. And so I sat down and I dutifully wrote a 1 minute speech as best I could. And I had never written a speech for anyone except myself previously, and certainly I'd never written one as short as 1 minute. So it was a challenge, and I learned from it. I'm not going to tell you it was the best piece of writing I ever did. I can't really remember exactly what I said. Whether it was true or not, even who knows? But hey, it was politics, so truth
whether
doesn't
it
matter
is
too
true or
much.
not.
Well, I mean, if you don't understand the topic, it's
Fair.
a little hard to,
Fair.
I mean,
Yeah.
then you're basically Chat GPT. So,
Right.
someone better proofread it at the end of the day. But I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, and
Yes.
particularly in Washington, where I got my start, it is very common to have very young, inexperienced people just told, "Hey, go and do this," and you're just kind of pointing in the right direction, and they hope.
Yeah.
Because a
You're
lot
right.
of organizations don't have much in the way of budgets.
Yep.
And so, they'll just roll the dice and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, there is something to be said for that too. And you're right. Like, make sure they don't drown, but I'll do allow them the opportunity to fail, because that is where they will learn, for sure. It's where we all learn.
And if you wait until they are ready, and I put that in air quotes, if you wait until they're ready, you will never be able to assign anything.
Nope.
So it is a balancing act. You need to make sure that they know enough that they're not going to instantly sink. You can't let them go in there with cinder blocks into the pool. But I've
You're
probably
just
tortured the pool
continuing
analogy.
with this.
Just
Yeah.
feet on this swimming pool analogy. Anyway, so do make sure that they have the basics, but don't wait until you feel like they are truly ready, because if you do, it'll never happen.
Yeah. I mean, I was a 27-year-old managing supervisor at a big global agency, and I was running a $2 million account. I had no business doing that. None. Zero. Zilch. But they threw me into the deep end. They're like, figure it out. And there were times that my boss was super mad at me. Like, I remember sitting in her office and her just berating me because I'd made the wrong decision. But they also let me make the wrong decision. And I have not made those wrong decisions since.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Washington, when I was 22, I was the chief investigator for a congressional subcommittee investigating the White House. I'm sitting across the table basically as the peer to the deputy White House counsel. That was nuts.
That's nuts. Yeah.
It's nuts. I mean, and most places other than Washington don't go quite to that extreme. And I'm not suggesting that you necessarily do that. If you've got Coca-Cola as your client, maybe you don't, put your fresh out of college, just barely above an intern account person in front of them and say, okay, this is your new account lead.
No.
Probably not the best idea.
Probably not.
Because it's not Washington, and so people don't accept it in the same way.
Right.
But you certainly can give them a lot more responsibility than you probably are inclined to, just based on your own nervous energy that most owners tend to have.
And let them go to meetings. Let them go to meetings and observe, and have them take notes. And certainly just say, and I had this experience in my career too, where I was told sit in the back and take notes and don't say anything. But you learn a lot just from sitting in those. You hear things, you observe things, and there are certainly questions that they will have from being in those meetings, but they should absolutely be in those meetings.
Absolutely. They should be in internal meetings. They should be external meetings. Invite them to more rather than less. You can always cut it back, right? You can always say, look, we're not going to large your schedule up by having you sit in on everything. But early on, if they're just getting started, have them sit in more rather than less. Yes. Have them, copy them on emails or forward them the emails after the fact so they can see, what the actual back and forth is, so that they can learn what is the style, how do you actually communicate? What are the steps? Because there's no real replacement for seeing how it's actually being done.
That's right. That's right. And there's no real replacement from learning from, people who have more experience, just observing what they're doing and how they're behaving and what they're saying. You can't replace that. You can't replace that with an online course. You can't replace it with professional development. You just can't.
And of course, you should visit SpinSucks, join the SpinSucks community. There's all sorts of good resources there and other places where you can access lots of information as a newbie to level up your skills. And of course, get that PESO certification. I got to.
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
I'll take my commission there for that. So.
No problem. Your check's in the mail.
Yeah. Great. Double last month's? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Still
all
zero.
Right. I think the listeners figured that one out. I don't think you needed to spell that one out for them. At least I hope that I have enough respect for the owners who listen to believe that they knew
they got that. I didn't need
that
to.
they got that. Yeah.
It's not funny if you have to tell them punchline. I get it.
Probably not funny anyway. Anyway, on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.